6 years, Naomi, and you still dress like you're saving for something. I heard the little fund is still just an idea. Here's to second chances for the rest of us. You were never gonna catch up.
Marcus held the wine glass like he'd already decided how the evening would end. 6 years, and you still dress like you're saving for something. That's almost admirable, Naomi. He said my name the way you'd flick something off your sleeve. Some of us actually built a life. Some of us just built excuses. He tilted the glass and let it fall. Down my collar, down the cream blazer I'd bought for this exact night, thinking I'd need to look like I belonged. He didn't wait to see if I'd flinch. He already knew the story he was going to tell about this moment before he told it. What he didn't know was the one detail sitting in my handbag that made pouring that glass the most expensive 30 seconds of his career. 6 years ago, Marcus Whitfield told me I would spend my life watching other people win. Tonight, he was 3 hours away from finding out exactly whose signature his $4 billion deal was waiting on. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from and your current watching time. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to like and hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming stories. The last thing Marcus said to me as my husband wasn't cruel. It was worse than cruel. It was certain. We stood in the kitchen of the house we'd bought together 8 years earlier, half the cabinets already emptied into boxes, and he looked at me with the specific calm of a man who believes he's already won an argument nobody else knew was happening. "You're not built for more than this, Naomi," he said. "Some people are meant to manage a household. Some people are meant to run something. I'm not being cruel. I'm being honest. You'll thank me one day for finally seeing it clearly." I didn't cry in front of him. I waited until his car left the driveway. Then I sat down on the kitchen floor between two half-packed boxes and let myself feel every bit of it, because I knew that once I stood back up, I wasn't going to let myself fall down again. Our daughter Ava was in the next room during that conversation. She was 7, doing homework at the dining table, and she has told me since, as an adult, that she remembers the specific quality of the silence after his car pulled away, the sound of nothing where a marriage used to be. I didn't tell her that night what had happened. I told her that her father was going to live somewhere else for a while, and that nothing about how much either of us loved her was going to change. She asked if it was because of something she did. I remember kneeling down on that kitchen floor, still in the clothes I'd been wearing when he left, and telling her no, this was never about her. This was about two adults who had stopped being able to build the same life. She was too young to understand it fully. She understood enough to stop asking after that night, which in its own way was worse. I want to be honest about what those 6 years looked like, because none of what happened later makes sense without it. When Marcus left, I had $11,000 in a savings account, a business degree I'd never used because he'd asked me to stay home when Ava was small, and an idea I'd been quietly building notes on for 2 years without telling him, because every time I'd mentioned it, he'd called it a hobby. The idea was Calloway Meridian Capital, an investment fund built around companies most of Wall Street ignored, mid-sized manufacturers and logistics firms in the parts of the country nobody wrote articles about. Marcus had called that plan a fantasy. He'd said I was chasing something that didn't exist, instead of accepting the life I actually had. He wasn't entirely wrong that it was a risk. He miscalculated everything else about it. The first 18 months were the hardest thing I have ever done. I worked out of a spare bedroom with a folding table and a landline because the internet in my apartment building kept cutting out during calls. I taught myself to read a balance sheet the way other people teach themselves a language, slowly, with a dictionary open beside me, making mistakes I was too embarrassed to admit to anyone. I picked Ava up from school every day at 3:15, made dinner, helped with homework, put her to bed, and then worked until 1 in the morning trying to understand markets that men twice my age had spent entire careers learning. There were nights I genuinely didn't know if I was building something or simply refusing to admit that I'd already failed. Ava would sometimes wander into the spare bedroom at midnight, unable to sleep, and sit quietly on the floor beside my chair doing nothing at all, just being there while I worked. And I've thought since that some of the most important hours of building that fund happened with a 7-year-old asleep against a filing cabinet 3 feet from my desk. I kept going anyway, because the alternative was becoming the version of myself Marcus had already decided I was, and because I wanted my daughter to grow up watching a woman finish something. By year 2, I closed my first deal, a small parts manufacturer outside Greensboro that everyone else had written off. It didn't make me rich. It made me right, and at the time that mattered more. I remember calling my sister from the parking lot afterward, sitting in my car with the engine off, and just saying, "It happened," over and over, because I didn't have any other words yet for what I was feeling. By year 3, 2 regional pension funds trusted me with real capital. By year 4, I moved the fund out of the spare bedroom and into a small leased office above a dry cleaner, 4 desks, 1 conference room, a coffee machine that never quite worked right. By year 5, Calloway Meridian had quietly become one of the most disciplined mid-market funds on the East Coast, the kind of fund other investors asked about but couldn't quite place, because I had made a deliberate choice early on to stay invisible. No interviews, no panels, no photographs at industry dinners. I wasn't interested in being known. I was interested in being right. And being right, I had learned, requires a kind of quiet that doesn't leave much room for performance. Which meant that by the time Whitfield Dynamics entered our pipeline as a potential deal, almost nobody outside a small circle of lawyers and board members knew who was actually sitting behind Calloway Meridian. Marcus certainly didn't. He had spent 6 years building his father's mid-size energy equipment company into something genuinely significant, expanding into new manufacturing contracts, doubling the workforce, positioning the company for a leap that would put it on a completely different scale. His instincts for the business were real. I want to be fair about that because fairness matters to this story. Whatever had broken between us, his talent for building something was never the question. The $4 billion investment my team had structured would let Whitfield Dynamics compete at a level that could reshape an entire segment of the industry. He'd been negotiating with our senior team for months. The paperwork was essentially finished. He simply hadn't met the person who had to sign it. I found out Marcus was engaged to a woman named Priya Sandhu about 4 months before the gala, from an industry newsletter of all places, a small item about Whitfield Dynamics' upcoming anniversary celebration that mentioned his fiancée would be co-hosting. I read it twice at my desk and then closed the laptop and went to pick Ava up from her college dorm for the weekend because some information doesn't need to be sat with immediately. Ava, 20 by then, studying finance herself, a fact her father had never once asked about, told me over dinner that weekend that she didn't want to go to the anniversary event if I ended up needing to attend for the deal. I told her I would handle whatever needed handling. I didn't fully know yet what that meant. The gala was being held at the Ashworth, a hotel downtown with high ceilings and dark wood paneling that hadn't been renovated since it stopped needing to be. The event marked Whitfield Dynamics' 15th anniversary, and unofficially, the unveiling of the deal everyone in that room already assumed was finished. I arrived without an assistant, without a driver waiting outside, without any of the small signals that typically tell a room you're someone worth paying attention to. That was deliberate. I had learned a long time ago that an organization shows you exactly what it is in the moments when the people inside it don't think they're being watched, and I wanted to see Whitfield Dynamics before I let my signature finalize $4 billion into its future. What I saw in the first 20 minutes did not sit well with me. I was near the main entrance when a young server, maybe 19 or 20, lost control of a tray stacked with champagne flutes, the whole thing tilting hard to one side. I stepped in and caught the edge before 3 glasses hit the marble floor. He exhaled hard and thanked me twice, hands shaking slightly. "You're all right," I told him. "Slow your breathing down. Nobody's going to remember this in an hour." That's when a woman in a dark blazer appeared beside us, without any urgency at all, already unfolding a linen napkin to help steady the tray. She had the composure of someone who solved problems for a living without ever needing anyone to notice she'd solved them. "Thank you," she said to me, and she meant it in a way that wasn't automatic. "I hope none of that got on you." "I'm fine," I told her. Nothing happened. She extended her hand anyway. "Dahlia Vance," she said. "I run event operations for the Ashworth." I told her my name. She didn't ask what I did for a living. She didn't glance past me towards someone more important. We talked for a few minutes about nothing of particular consequence, about the hotel's history, about how many events she'd run in that ballroom over the years, and she treated the conversation like it mattered, simply because that's how she moved through a room. I filed that away. It would matter later. I was still near that corridor when Marcus walked in. He hadn't changed in the way people change when they grow into themselves. He'd changed in the way people change when they grow into their defenses instead, shoulders set a little too deliberately, chin lifted a fraction too high, an entrance that had clearly been practiced until it looked natural. His fiancée, Priya Sandhu, walked beside him, sharp-eyed, already scanning the room for who was worth her attention. He saw me. I watched surprise move across his face first, quick and completely unrehearsed, and then something colder settled in behind it, the particular satisfaction of a man who has told himself a story for 6 years and believes he's just been handed proof. He looked at my dress, my shoes, the empty space around me where an entourage should have been standing. He didn't need to say anything. I already knew what he was thinking. Priya leaned toward his ear and murmured something, and he tilted his head slightly in my direction and answered her without lowering his voice quite enough. "An old habit of mine," he said. I heard it clearly. I didn't react. I picked up a glass of water from a passing tray and kept doing exactly what I'd come to do, which was watch. About 20 minutes later, Gerald Ashby found me in a quiet side hallway off the main ballroom. Gerald was the chairman of the Whitfield Dynamics board and one of only 3 people who had met with me directly during the deal process, because I had insisted on keeping the circle small. He was a careful man, 71 years old, who had spent 4 decades learning exactly what an expensive mistake looks like 30 seconds before it happens. He came to me holding a leather folder under one arm. "Everything's finalized," he said. "Signatures are ready whenever you are. I can clear the side room in 10 minutes if you'd like to close tonight." He opened the folder. The documents were inside, clean, tabbed, a pen tucked neatly into the binding. I looked at them for a long moment, and then I closed the folder and handed it back to him. "Not tonight," I said. Gerald studied me carefully. "Is there a problem with the terms?" he asked. "The terms are fine," I told him. "I want to see who I'm actually handing this money to before I put my name on it." Gerald had worked with me long enough by then not to press further. He simply nodded and told me he'd be nearby if I needed him. I walked back into the ballroom and I watched. Marcus moved through the crowd the way he always had, magnetic in short bursts, laughing at exactly the right beats, touching people's arms with a warmth that looked sincere from a distance and calculated from close up. Priya stood near the bar, and I watched her wave off a server twice without looking at him, the way you'd wave off a fly, and then complain to another guest, loudly enough for the server to hear, that the staff at the Ashworth had gotten noticeably worse since the last event she'd attended there. The server said nothing, kept his expression perfectly neutral, and moved on to the next table. I noticed Dahlia, several feet away, register the moment without reacting to it either, though something in her posture told me she'd noticed, and filed it exactly the way I had. Marcus quizzed one of his own junior executives in front of a small group about a supply chain detail he clearly already knew the answer to, not because he needed the information, but because he wanted the room to watch him ask the questions. The young man stammered slightly before landing on the right figure, and Marcus let the pause sit a beat too long before nodding, as if granting approval. Nobody laughed at that except the people standing closest to him, and they laughed because that was the room he had trained them to be in. I thought about $4 billion, about what that amount of money does when it's handed to someone who has learned to lead through a mixture of charm and quiet contempt, and about the roughly 2,000 employees at Whitfield Dynamics who would be living inside whatever culture that money built. People who had nothing to do with anything, sitting between Marcus and me, who would simply be working underneath whatever version of leadership walked away from that ballroom with a signed contract. Then the formal program began. 2 board members spoke, one of them Gerald, delivering brief, measured remarks about the company's growth that felt more honest than anything Marcus had said all evening. A short video played, showing 15 years of real growth, a genuinely impressive company built on genuinely hard work, plant floors and engineers, and long-serving employees speaking about what the company meant to them. I sat with 2 true things at once, that this organization had built something worth protecting, and that the man at the top of it had built something underneath it that worried me more with every minute I watched. Marcus took the stage. He was good up there, easy and confident, and for a few minutes the whole room belonged to him completely. Then his eyes swept the crowd and found me, and I watched the decision form in real time, something Priya had probably planted hours earlier now presenting itself live in front of everyone whose respect he'd spent 15 years cultivating. "Come on up here," he said, and his voice carried through the room with the exact weight of a summons dressed up as an invitation. I walked to the front. The crowd parted to watch. Marcus lifted a fresh glass of red wine from the podium table. "6 years ago," he said, his voice smooth and comfortable, "I made the hardest decision of my life. I walked away from someone who couldn't build a future for herself." A ripple of laughter moved through the room, the specific laughter of an audience that has been quietly told how to feel. He looked directly at me. There was a light in his eyes I can only describe as satisfaction, the deep, almost physical satisfaction of someone who has waited a long time for exactly this moment. "Tonight," he said, "we're closing a $4 billion deal." He let the numbers sit in the air. "Sometimes walking away really is the smartest investment you'll ever make." The laughter got louder. Someone applauded. The room had given itself over to him entirely. I looked back at him. I didn't look away. I didn't flinch. I didn't give him anything to react to. The silence coming from my direction seemed to reach him before anything else did, and I watched him realize, in real time, that he wasn't getting the reaction he'd built the whole moment around. That absence apparently was unbearable. He reached out, lifted the glass, and in one clean motion poured the entire contents of it across my shoulders, down the front of my dress. The wine was cold. It moved through the fabric instantly. I stood completely still. For a moment, the room went utterly silent. Then Priya laughed first, sharp and performative, the kind of laugh designed to tell everyone else how they were supposed to process what had just happened. A few phones came up. Dahlia Vance was already moving toward me from across the room, a linen cloth halfway out of her jacket pocket, before I even registered her stepping forward. I raised one hand, just slightly, and she stopped where she was. I picked up a cloth napkin from the nearest table and pressed it against my collar without urgency, without any anger showing on my face at all. Then I looked at Marcus directly. "I thought maybe 6 years might have changed you," I said. He lifted his chin. "You think you have any right to judge how I run my life?" he said. I took my phone out of my clutch. There was only one number I needed. It rang once. "This is Naomi Calloway," I said. The voice on the other end shifted instantly into something formal. "Good evening, Ms. Calloway," right away. I heard Marcus's breathing change slightly. He'd caught something in that exchange he couldn't fully place yet, and the not knowing kept him exactly where he was standing, a wine glass still loose in his hand, trying to recalculate everything in real time. I spoke clearly enough for the people nearby to hear every word. "Freeze the Whitfield Dynamics transaction," I said. "All $4 billion. There was a brief silence on the line, and then, "Understood, ma'am," right away. I held Marcus's stare through the entire call. Then I ended it, slid the phone back into my clutch, and walked out of the ballroom without looking back once. The hallway outside was quiet, in the particular way a hallway is quiet, just beyond a room full of noise, where the sound becomes something you can feel pressing against a closed door, rather than something you can hear directly. I walked to the far end near a window overlooking the city, and stood there for a long time, with the wine still cooling against my skin. I loosened the collar of my dress, and thought about what I'd just done, and whether I would have done it any differently given the choice again, and I decided, standing there, that I wouldn't have. I also thought, standing at that window, about Ava, about how I would explain this to her the next morning, and I realized I wasn't dreading that conversation the way I might have expected to. I was almost looking forward to it. Gerald found me maybe 15 minutes later. He came quietly, the way he did everything, and stood beside me looking out at the same skyline before he said anything at all. "She knows," he said finally. "How did she take it?" I asked. He considered the question the way he considered everything, carefully. "I put the file up on the screen in the side office," he said. "Full name, title, the complete deal history behind Calloway Meridian." He was quiet a moment. She didn't say anything for a while. Then she asked how it was possible. "I want to explain something here, because it matters for what comes next." Priya had known for 6 years that I built something after the divorce. She had simply never bothered to learn what it was, because Marcus had already told her the ending of that story a long time ago, and she had never once questioned whether he'd gotten it right. Gerald told me later that when he pulled up the fund's history on that screen, the first deal listed was the small parts manufacturer outside Greensboro from year 2, the one Marcus had specifically mocked when I mentioned it to him during our marriage, calling it a waste of a good idea on a company too small to matter. She recognized the name of that manufacturer instantly, Gerald said, because it happened to be one of Whitfield Dynamics' own longtime suppliers, a relationship she herself had helped negotiate 2 years earlier, without ever realizing whose fund sat quietly behind the other side of that deal. That was when she sat down. There it was, the detail I had never explained to anyone, arriving back to Priya and eventually to Marcus through a screen and a stunned silence in a side office, not as a weapon I'd designed, just as the plain truth of everything that had happened in the 6 years between a kitchen floor and a ballroom. "She's asking to speak with you directly," Gerald said. "I know," I told him. "She still doesn't fully understand what's happening. She will." Gerald nodded once. "The board is in emergency session," he said. "Accounts are frozen. Every partner who touched this deal is calling." "What do you want me to do?" "Go back in," I told him. "Tell the board I'll be in contact by morning." He nodded and walked back toward the ballroom, and I stayed at that window until the hallway had gone completely quiet. I called Ava from my car in the parking garage before I drove home. She picked up on the second ring, half asleep. I told her something had happened at the event, that I was fine, that I'd explain everything in the morning, and that she shouldn't worry. She asked if it involved her father. I told her yes. She was quiet for a second, and then she said, "Good," in a tone I hadn't expected, flat and certain, and I understood in that moment that my daughter had been carrying her own version of that kitchen floor for 13 years, one she'd never once mentioned to me. The call came the next morning, not from Marcus directly. He wasn't in a position to call me directly yet, because some part of him still hadn't accepted that the number he needed belonged to me. Gerald placed the initial call to my assistant at 7:40, relaying that Whitfield Dynamics was requesting an urgent meeting with Calloway Meridian's leadership. My assistant told him I had an opening at 2. Gerald arrived early, 1:15, to brief me on what had happened after I left the hotel. He sat across the conference table and delivered it the way he delivered everything, flatly, without embellishment, letting the facts do their own work. The account freezes had triggered within minutes of my call. By 10 that morning, 2 of Whitfield Dynamics' largest supply partners had already reached out with concerns after word of the freeze spread through the industry faster than anyone at the company could contain it. The board convened an emergency session at 11, and Priya, in front of the full board, had stated clearly and on record that the incident at the gala had been entirely Marcus's decision, that she had been standing several feet away, that she had attempted to intervene, that her presence had been badly mischaracterized by anyone suggesting otherwise. One board member apparently had asked her directly why she'd laughed. Gerald said she didn't have an answer for that one. Gerald delivered all of it without any particular expression on his face. I listened without any particular expression on mine either. How is he? I asked. Gerald considered it. He understands the situation, he said finally, which was as precise an answer as I was ever going to get out of Gerald Ashby, and it told me everything I needed to know. Marcus arrived at Calloway Meridian at 1:58. I know that because I watched his car pull up from my office window on the 11th floor. He came alone, no Priya, no lawyer, which told me he had made a deliberate decision to walk into that room without any armor around him, and I noted what that meant. He was escorted to the main conference room. I gave him 4 minutes before I walked in. He was standing when I entered, not because anyone had told him to, but because sitting felt like the wrong posture for the moment, and he hadn't worked out yet what the right one was. He hadn't slept. That much was obvious. I sat down at the head of the table. He sat a moment later. Neither of us spoke for a while. The room had a wall of windows facing north across the city, a view I'd chosen deliberately when we first moved into that building 4 years earlier, not because I needed it, but because I wanted a room that made the scale of what we were building impossible to ignore. Marcus looked at the skyline for a moment. Then he looked at me. "I'm sorry," he said, "about last night." I let the sentence sit there before I answered it. "Are you sorry you poured wine on me?" I asked. "Or sorry the woman you poured it on turned out to hold the $4 billion your company needed?" He absorbed that without flinching outwardly, though I could see he'd already asked himself some version of that question overnight, and hadn't liked whatever answer he'd come up with. "I didn't know who you were," he said. "I didn't know about Calloway Meridian. I didn't know any of it." "I know you didn't," I said. "That's the problem." He looked at me directly then. "You didn't do what you did last night because you knew I had something you wanted," I told him. "You did it because you believed I had nothing, and you decided that belief gave you permission." I let that settle for a moment. If I had walked into that room last night with a title everyone recognized and 2 assistants trailing behind me, none of this happens. You know that. I know that. He didn't argue with it. "Gerald told me something this morning," he said quietly, "about the fund's first deal. About the manufacturer outside Greensboro." He waited a beat. "You mocked that deal," I said. "You called it a waste of a good idea on a company too small to ever matter. Those were your exact words, in our kitchen, 4 months before you left." He looked down at the table for a long moment. "I built an entire fund partly on something you told me couldn't succeed," I said. "I built it because I believed it was worth building. Your opinion of it was one data point. I chose not to let it be the only one I listened to." He was quiet after that for longer than he'd been quiet at any point since walking in. When he finally spoke, whatever professional distance he'd carried into the room had mostly drained out of his voice. "I spent 6 years telling myself I made the right call," he said. "I know," I told him. "When I saw you last night." He stopped, started again. "I told myself it didn't matter that you were there. That it was just a coincidence. But it mattered. It mattered more than I wanted it to, and I didn't know what to do with that feeling, so I—" He stopped a second time. "Made me the problem instead," I said. "Yes," he said. "There's something else," he added after a moment. "Ava won't return my calls. She hasn't in almost a year. I didn't say anything to that. I found out last night she works in finance now," he said. "I didn't know that either." I let that sit in the room for a moment before I spoke. "She's very good at it," I said. "That's not something I'm going to explain to you today." I had thought carefully about what I wanted to say in that room, not because I needed a script, but because I wanted to be honest about the difference between what I felt sitting across from him and what was actually true, since those two things aren't always the same, and I've learned to check the distance between them carefully before I speak. "I don't hold the divorce against you," I told him. "I want to be clear about that. You made a decision you had every right to make. I wasn't giving you the life you thought you needed. Those are real things, and I'm not here to relitigate any of it." He was listening carefully now. "What I'm not willing to do," I said, "is hand $4 billion to a leadership structure that treats the people underneath it as instruments instead of people. Not because of last night specifically, because of what last night showed me about every night I didn't happen to be watching. There are close to 2,000 people at Whitfield Dynamics," he said quietly. "They didn't pour wine on you." "No," I said. "They didn't. If this deal collapses," he said, "departments get cut. People lose jobs they've held for a decade. Don't make them pay for what I did." I had already thought about exactly that, standing at the window the night before, and again on the drive home, and again at 6 that morning when the city was still quiet enough to think clearly. "I'm not going to," I told him. I laid it out plainly, without softening any part of it. The deal with him personally as chief executive was finished, and that wasn't a position I was open to negotiating. But Calloway Meridian's interest in Whitfield Dynamics as a company was separate from its interest in him as its leader. The business itself was sound and worth the investment. The leadership as it currently stood was not. Marcus would step down from the CEO role. Priya would be removed from any executive function entirely, and given what the board's internal review was already surfacing independently about her conduct towards staff, that removal would stand on its own grounds, with nothing to do with me. The board would run an internal search for new leadership, supported by a process my team would help structure. Once that transition was complete, we would reopen negotiations, not as a favor, but because the underlying business still deserved the chance to grow, and the people who'd spent 15 years building it deserved to see that growth continue under someone who valued them. Marcus sat through all of it without interrupting. When I finished, he asked one question. "Is there anything I could say right now that changes the first part?" he asked. "No," I told him. He nodded slowly, the nod of a man who had already known the answer before he asked it. "Then I'll take it back to the board," he said. He stood. I stood a moment later. We were just two people standing in a room 11 floors above a city that had gone on entirely indifferent to everything that had happened between us over 6 years and the 12 hours before this one. "I built something real," he said. Not defensively, just as a fact he needed spoken aloud once. "You did," I told him, and I meant it. He left. The board accepted every term within 48 hours. The internal review confirmed what Gerald had already suspected about Priya's conduct. A documented pattern of behavior toward junior staff. Dismissive comments logged in 3 separate HR complaints over the preceding year that gave the board more than enough grounds for her removal on its own merits. She was gone within the week, and she didn't go quietly, but she went. Marcus submitted his resignation the following Thursday. The public statement was brief and carefully worded and said nothing about what had actually happened, which was probably the right decision. There would be time later for the full shape of that story to settle if it ever needed to. The transition took just under 4 months. My team worked alongside the incoming board to rebuild the leadership structure and reopen the framework for the investment. Gerald called me midway through that process to tell me the board had settled on a new chief executive, a woman named Luisa Ferreira, who had run operations at Whitfield Dynamics for 11 years without ever once appearing in the press, and who, according to Gerald, had spent her first week in the role personally visiting every plant floor to introduce herself to line workers by name. I liked her before I ever met her. The final agreement, when we signed it, was a cleaner deal than the original had ever been, because everyone on the other side of the table now had the right reasons for being there. The $4 billion went where it was always supposed to go, into the workforce, into the supply chain partnerships, into the manufacturing expansion that had been waiting on capital for over a year. Almost 2,000 people kept the jobs they'd built their lives around. That mattered to me more than anything else in the entire deal. 2 weeks after the transition closed, I called Dahlia Vance directly. On her way out of the Ashworth that night after everything had unraveled, she'd stopped in the hallway and pressed her card into my hand without any explanation, the same quiet directness she'd carried through every moment of that evening. I'd kept it in my clutch for 4 months. I told her what I was building inside Calloway Meridian on the operations and culture side, and I told her exactly why I was calling her specifically. She was quiet for a moment after I explained it. "You're offering me this because of what happened that night," she said. "I'm offering you this because of what I saw that night," I told her. "There's a difference. What you did wasn't for an audience. You moved towards someone being humiliated with absolutely no reason to think it would benefit you in any way. That's not something you can train into a person. It's either already there or it isn't." She thought about it for 3 days, and then called back and said yes. She's been with the fund a year now, and she runs the office the way she ran that ballroom, quietly, completely, without ever once needing anyone to notice. I told Ava everything, eventually, in full, over a long dinner about a month after the transition closed. Not the version I'd given her as a child, kneeling on a kitchen floor, but the whole of it, the 18 months in the spare bedroom, the nights she'd fallen asleep against the filing cabinet, the gala, the phone call, the boardroom. She listened without interrupting, the same way Marcus had, though for entirely different reasons. When I finished, she asked why I hadn't told her the full story years earlier. I told her I hadn't wanted her carrying my anger as her own. She said quietly that she'd been carrying some version of it anyway, whether I'd handed it to her or not, and that she would rather have known. I've thought about that a great deal since. There's a version of protecting the people you love that just delays the conversation. I'm trying to be better at knowing the difference now. 4 months after the transition finished, I was getting coffee near my office on an ordinary Wednesday morning when I heard someone say my name. Marcus was sitting at a table near the window with a notebook open in front of him and a cup gone cold beside it. He looked like someone in the middle of working something out. There was something quieter about him than I'd seen in years, not defeated exactly, but undefended in a way he hadn't let himself be in a long time. I got my coffee and walked over. "I didn't know you came here," he said. "Most mornings," I told him. "It's close to the office." He smiled slightly, nothing performative in it this time, something smaller and more honest. "I've been thinking about something," he said. "I spent 6 years telling myself leaving was the smartest decision I ever made. The clearest proof I knew exactly what I was doing. I waited. I think I needed to believe that so badly," he said, "that I turned you into evidence somehow. Every time I succeeded at something, it felt like proof I'd been right to leave. And every time I thought about you, he looked out the window for a moment. I think I needed you to be struggling, because if you weren't struggling, then what exactly had I proven? The coffee shop was quiet around us. Someone ground beans behind the counter. Outside, the street went on with its ordinary Wednesday business, indifferent to all of it. When I saw you at that gala, he said, and you looked exactly the same, calm, completely unimpressed by any of it, I panicked. And I turned that panic into cruelty, because that's the only tool I knew how to reach for. I know, I said. The worst part isn't losing the deal or the title, he said. He turned back from the window. The worst part is realizing I'd become someone who needed other people to feel smaller just so I could feel like I was standing at the right height, and I didn't even notice it happening to me. I looked at him for a long moment. That's not an easy thing to say out loud, I told him. No, he agreed. It isn't. He mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that Ava had finally agreed to have coffee with him, just once, no promises beyond that. I told him that sounded like the right place to start, and that whatever happened after that conversation was between the two of them, not something I intended to manage on his behalf. I picked up my coffee. Good luck, Marcus, I said. I meant it. He nodded. I know you do, he said. I walked out. The morning was bright and cold the way fall mornings get in that city, the kind of light that makes everything look like it's still in the middle of being decided. I walked the few blocks back to the office, took the elevator up, and sat down at my desk facing a skyline I could see clear to the horizon on a morning like that one. There was no version of that walk where I felt triumphant. What I felt was quieter than that, and harder to name, something close to clarity, the understanding that you don't have to carry what someone else put down badly, and you never have to hand it back to them in the same condition they left it in. Marcus wasn't going to rebuild overnight. What he'd named at that table takes longer to work through than one honest conversation over cold coffee. But he was asking himself the right questions now, and that counted for something real. I had asked him once, a long time ago, to believe in something I couldn't fully prove yet. He hadn't been able to do it. I couldn't hold that against him forever. What I could do, what I had already done, was build the thing anyway, not to prove him wrong, but because it was mine to build, and I had always known it was worth building. The only real answer to someone telling you that you'll never get anywhere is to go there quietly and let the distance speak for itself. Calloway Meridian kept moving. Whitfield Dynamics kept moving, under better hands than it had known in years, with almost 2,000 people going to work every morning inside a culture that had finally started to match the effort they'd been putting into it all along. Ava kept moving too, in her own direction, building her own version of what she'd watched me build, though she'd tell you she's doing it faster than I did, and she's not wrong. And somewhere in that city on an ordinary Wednesday morning, both her father and I were learning what comes after the story you thought was going to define you turns out to be just one chapter, not the whole book. That's the thing about verdicts. They only hold if you agree to accept them. I never did. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who never bothered to wait and see what you were becoming, drop a comment and share this with someone who needs to hear it today. The real measure of a person was never where they stood when someone walked away from them. It's where they were standing when they finally stopped needing to prove anything at all. So, what would you have said if the person who told you, "You'll never make it," was standing in front of you the day you finally did? Drop your answer in the comments. We read every single one, and we'd love to hear which part of tonight's story hit you the hardest. Let us know if this particular story managed to keep you with us for the entire runtime. You're in the right place. Subscribe to the channel, like and turn on the notification bell for more powerful stories filled with shocking twists, family drama, family betrayals, hidden secrets, and unforgettable endings. Thanks for watching. Until the next unforgettable story, love you all.